Sony was founded by Akio Morita and Masaru Ibuka in 1946. It wasn't called Sony at the time, but first things first. Masaru Ibuka was a son of an engineer and took an interest in various technologies from early childhood. He graduated with honors in electrical engineering from Waseda University in 1936. His thesis was a prize winner at the Paris exhibition. He followed in his father's footsteps and was the boast of his family, which can't be said about the second founder, Akio. He was the eldest son of the influential Morita family and an heir to the family business. Even though the boy was raised as a future successor, Akio chose a different path, which disappointed his father, although it was his father who would later finance his friend's company. Akio and Masaru met during World War II while they were engaged in developing submarine-detecting aircraft equipment. The friends parted ways when the war ended in 1945. Akio returned to Nagoya while Masaru went to Tokyo to earn money. The country was in ruins. Masaru rented a small room on the fourth floor of a burnt, half-ruined shopping mall in Tokyo. There, he and 7 of his workers did radio repairs. They were ready to do any work to provide for their families. Soon they introduced their products, with a rice cooker being the most popular one. To be honest, its quality was terrible, but its low price attracted customers, which was enough for Masaru to survive. Masaru was eager to invent something new, something worthy, but at that time he didn't know what. He noticed that his fellow citizens had an interest in the news, which was logical because the country was occupied and people didn't know what the next day would bring them. Their fate depended on America. So people wanted to hear the news from the United States. But there was a problem. American radio used short waves to broadcast, and Japanese radios couldn't receive their signal. Masaru created a shortwave converter to solve this problem. This product proved incredibly successful. It was even mentioned in the media. Akio read one of the newspapers and immediately wrote a letter to his old friend expressing his eagerness to work together. Of course, Masaru was happy to accept this cooperative offer. Upon his arrival in Tokyo, Akio saw their workshop in the nearly burned-down building. This could have demotivated Akio, but Masaru's team's enthusiasm towards their work inspired the young engineer. Soon Akio turned to his father asking for financial support. It was a hard talk. The relatives couldn't understand why the heir of the 300-year-old business was living a miserable life, working in a burned-down building and spending nights in the middle of nowhere. However, his father showed self-restraint and granted his son's request, becoming the first shareholder of their future company. Thus, the Tokyo Telecommunications Engineering Corporation, or TTK, was established in 1946. Akio and Masaru moved their company from a shopping mall to a factory on the hill in the southern part of Tokyo. The business was developing slowly but steadily. When the American military launched a broad public propaganda campaign in '49, they had to solve a problem with radio broadcasting. They learned about Masaru's invention and contacted the young company with a lucrative offer. While negotiating, Masaru noticed a tape recorder in the office. His sixth sense told him that it was an invention of the future. After purchasing the Wonder Machine, engineers began to study it in order to create their own analog. Recreating a magnetic tape proved to be the most difficult. They needed a carrier and magnetic powder. The first material used was cellophane, but it stretched and distorted the sound, so by trying and failing, the team came up with craft paper. For magnetic powder, they used a magnet invented by Dr. Yagoro Kato, but it turned out to be too powerful. The necessary properties had iron oxide, and in one of the books on chemistry, the team learned that it could be obtained by heating oxalic ferrite. Having obtained the necessary reagent, they heated it to the required conditions on an ordinary frying pan. The obtained substance was mixed with varnish and applied to paper strips of craft paper, thus recreating the magnetic tape. This tape recorder was primitive, weighed 35 kilos, and was very expensive, about $500. This money was enough for a Japanese family to live for a whole month, indulging in all pleasures. And the sound quality wasn't perfect. But the engineers were proud of their invention. They believed in their brainchild's success, believed to such an extent that they produced as many as 50 tape recorders. They were sure they had solved the most difficult part and that selling them would be a piece of cake, but they were wrong. Although it was extremely difficult to invent it, it turned out to be far more difficult to sell it. No one was interested in tape recorders. By the way, it's noteworthy that people who saw the presentations said that the device was particularly good and praised it in every way, but didn't buy it. Not a single tape recorder was sold until Masaru by accident discovered a US military booklet called 999 Ways to Use a Tape Recorder. This book became an effective marketing tool. Also, by the time he discovered this booklet, he realized that he shouldn't demonstrate his invention to just anybody, but should select specific prospects. A colleague told him that there weren't enough shorthand typists in courts. He used Akio's father's acquaintances to make a presentation in court, and the American booklet was his trump card. He didn't have to invent anything. Everything had already been invented for him. After the presentation, as many as 20 tape recorders were bought from him. Then he went to schools. There, he also managed to sell almost all the product available at the time. Rumors about TTK's great products spread quickly around the city, and the Tokyo Academy of Arts succumbed to his new fashion and ordered so many tape recorders that soon TTK had to expand its production facilities and move to a larger building in Shinagawa. It was not only that the Academy of Arts ensured the company's financial well-being, but also gave them a future manager. One of the students, Norita Oga, was dissatisfied with the TTK tape recorders. He wrote so many criticizing letters that Akio decided to meet the audacious student face-to-face. During their conversation, he suggested that Norita try doing better himself, and he succeeded. When a new recorder was under development, he worked as an advisor. As a result, they released a new tape recorder model with better sound. Masaru appreciated the young man's success and offered him to continue consulting with engineers, but Oga refused due to his duties at the academy. The company was doing well, but soon Masaru became concerned about the market's instability. Customers either bought hundreds of tape recorders or didn't buy them at all. He decided that he couldn't depend on one country and decided to go on an exploratory trip to the United States. Upon arrival in the US, he planned to study the production of tape recorders, talk to American customers about what they liked, what they didn't like, and what they wanted. However, he wasn't allowed into the production facilities, and the customers said nothing worthwhile. They talked more about the kind of music they liked rather than about tape recorders. The trip could have been a complete failure if he hadn't found out about Bell Labs' new invention, a transistor. He heard about the Western Electric Company. They used this technology to produce hearing kits and were ready to sell the transistor production patent. His sixth sense helped him again, as it happened with tape recorders. He realized that transistors would replace vacuum tubes. It wasn't a question of if, but when. Coming back to Japan, he sent Akio to the Ministry of Trade and Industry, hoping that his family would help him in the upcoming negotiations. The problem was that a total state currency control was introduced in Japan in the 1950s. All export revenues were transferred to the state currency account and were given to enterprises only for strictly specified transactions. That is, officials decided what they could spend money on and what they couldn't. Simply put, dollars couldn't be bought, but they couldn't buy the patent for yens either. Akio spent 6 months knocking on the ministry doors, trying to prove the importance of the transistor. Finally, he had to explain the potential of his invention in layman's terms. Friction accompanies any action, and friction wears out the material, which leads to breakdowns, and there's no friction in the transistor. Finally, he managed to convince the officials, and he received $25,000 for the upcoming deal with Western Electric. Getting the patent wasn't enough. They had to comprehend the technology. They managed to study and describe the tunnel effect in diodes, for which Leo Esaki was awarded the Nobel Prize. The development of his new technology allowed them to create the TR-55 revolutionary transistor radio in 1955. Akio took his new radio to the USA, but before that he decided to rename the brand. The new name was based on a Latin word, sonus, meaning sound, which also resembled the slang word sunny boy, which meant a smart boy. They removed the N since sunny sounds like losing money in Japanese, so they were left with Sony. Japanese companies usually sold their products on the international markets using trading houses such as Mitsui and Mitsubishi as intermediaries. Although the American audience already knew these trading companies, Akio refused to do business with them. They knew nothing about his products and didn't share his business philosophy. Akio went to New York where he met representatives of a few large retail companies. Bulova was among them. The company got so interested in the recorders that it ordered as many as 100,000 devices. The order amount exceeded the cost of Sony, but Bulova laid down a condition that the product would be sold under their brand, and Akio refused. The representatives of the American company tried to convince Akio, arguing that no one knew his brand, unlike their trademark that had earned the customer's trust, to which Akio replied that 50 years before, people hadn't heard about their company either. Akio managed to get far smaller scale contracts, but the main thing was that they were under the Sony brand. This ensured the company's growth, albeit slowly. The Sony brand was becoming increasingly popular, and the trade name was registered in 170 countries around the globe to prevent even the possibility of being stolen. But this still happened, moreover, in their native country. A chocolate producer took their brand. Even the letter design was exactly the same as theirs. Another reason why it was a blow to their reputation was that not everyone liked the chocolate. It marked the beginning of a 4-year-long legal suit, which allowed them to defend their name. At the same time, their old friend Noria Oga began writing letters to the company's headquarters again, criticizing the company for employing too many engineers, lacking managers and marketers, and being generally managed in the wrong and old-fashioned way. Akio had a meeting with the musician and suggested that he show a masterclass. The musician refused, saying that he needed creative freedom and that an office desk was a suitable place for him. Then Akio found a different solution to the problem. He sent his wife to Norio's wife, and the female influence persuaded Oga to agree to work for Sony. In the first year of his work, he developed the marketing department. He managed to lure away a few dozen leading specialists in the field from other companies. In '57, the TR-63 pocket radio was introduced into the market in the US and became a top seller. During the advertising campaign, Sony used special shirts with big chest pockets, which could easily hold the radio. Akio understood that the radio era was coming to an end, and the future belonged to television. He instructed his team to solve this problem. And they didn't let him down. They developed the world's first transistor TV in 1960, the TV-8301. The Mini TV made Sony a world-famous company, but didn't bring in any money. Televisions were very expensive and believed to be luxury goods. There was also problems with those who sold them and how they were sold. Sony's products were sold by distribution chains, and the largest partner was a retail chain called Delmonico. The first models had certain drawbacks and got broken frequently. Without coordinating their actions with Sony, Delmonico launched a broad advertising campaign and started selling TVs, which naturally irritated Akio, since Sony wasn't ready to sell TVs in large quantities. Sony did everything they could to improve their new product as quickly as possible, but they were criticized because their TVs were expensive. The distributors insisted on sacrificing quality for the sake of price. Akio couldn't accept such a policy and decided to exclude intermediaries and sell his goods directly to customers. This paid off in the long run, but at the time, he had to endure both the court costs since Delmonico sued Sony for breaking the contract and won, and the cost of building the company's stores. After that, Sony started building its sales network. Thus, they opened up a showroom in Tokyo's Ginza district, where everyone could have a look at the goods. It was very modern and one of the most expensive buildings in Tokyo, but the result was worth the money. The store became extremely popular, and later they opened a similar showroom in New York on Fifth Avenue, where wealthy Americans walked and worked, the ones who could afford expensive TVs. Akio knew where to open. He lived in New York most of the time and even brought his family to the city in the '60s, which was very strange considering the Japanese mentality. It was uncommon for the Japanese to take their wives to business meetings, and they generally didn't mix family, work, and friends. The Americans were a completely different story. It wasn't uncommon for them to sign important contracts at family gatherings. Coming to the United States, Japanese businessmen generally stood apart. Their social circle was limited to their countrymen, which resulted in being strangers even after many years overseas. Akio broke this pattern. He integrated into the American rhythm of life. Renting a 12-room apartment on Fifth Avenue, where the famous violinist Nathan Milstein used to live. He often threw parties that gave him a lot of useful acquaintances. At one of these informal gatherings, he was told where and how to open his showroom. Sony's brand new store immediately became popular, as did their TVs. The company got so many orders that its facilities weren't enough to produce the required quality. Indeed, this was thanks to his new wealthy friends, who recommended Akio's products to others in high places. Because he refused to work through intermediaries, Akio needed money, and he had stock exchange sharks among his new American friends. They were all surprised that there wasn't a single Japanese company on the New York Stock Exchange and thought that it was high time for Akio to become the first. He followed their advice. Sony became the first Japanese company listed on the stock exchange, earning $4 million from selling its stocks, which was an incredible amount of money at the time. Of course, it wasn't as easy as it looked. Sony had to coordinate everything with the Japanese Ministry of Finance and the American Securities and Exchange Commission. Unlike the Japanese part that fully supported the company, the Japanese Prime Minister was an active advocate for establishing international relations and opposed conservative officials. The American part caused certain problems. It was hard for the Japanese to explain their business model, but the main problem was total chaos in their accounting statements. Akio hated red tape and didn't control these processes. As a result, it took a lot of effort and time to sort out the paperwork. With the new funding, Sony was conquering new horizons and exporting its goods to Europe. It was a new market, and the Japanese company again had to resort to distributors, but they took every possible chance to refuse their services. Thus, after refusing the intermediaries in England, its sales tripled, but their refusals in Germany were even more illustrative. But events proved that the sales increased by several times after getting rid of German intermediaries. At that time, the Germans were the world leaders in electronics, and their products were commonly believed to be the best. Indeed, it was impossible to refuse dealers completely, but that wasn't necessary. Dealers demanded color TVs from Akio, because competitors already had ones, and at the time to introduce something new again. Sony failed to tackle the new challenge until 1968, when Trinitron hit the market. The new TV's picture was 25% brighter than the competitors, and the device was far more reliable. Today, half a century later, there's still a few working models. Sony was developing rapidly, capturing more and more of the American market. It was becoming increasingly difficult for domestic manufacturers to compete with the Japanese company. To combat the foreigners, they rushed to accuse Sony of dumping, that is, of devaluing their goods to oust domestic producers. This accusation was rather strange, since generally Sony-branded goods were more expensive than those of its competitors. Anti-Japanese rallies swept across the country. Citizens were angry that the Americans lost jobs because of the Japanese, but companies from the land of the rising sun didn't offer them any work opportunities. This was a common trait of Japanese businesses. The employment issue was fundamental for them, and of course, they gave all their jobs to their fellow citizens. Toyota faced the same problem. The U.S. Congress and President Richard Nixon passed a number of important restriction laws. This forced Akio to build a U.S. factory. That's not to say that this was a problem for Sony. They had long planned to deploy production in America. But Akio was irritated by the fact that this was done on the pretext of fighting for jobs for American citizens, because American producers sought to open factories in countries with cheap labor. The factory was built in San Diego, and a bit later, there were two more built in Europe, in Barcelona and Stuttgart. Masaru noticed that TVs seemed to enslave people. If you missed a program, you would never see it again. People adjusted to the television program schedule, changed their plans. At the same time, major radio stations could record videos, So why not give that opportunity to ordinary people by developing a compact video recorder that wouldn't take up the entire room and could record people's favorite shows, which they missed? Masaru headed the development and set the task for the engineers that a video recorder should be no larger than a TV, and a cassette should be enough for at least an hour-long video. It took years to develop. However, in 1975, Sony launched a revolutionary video system, Betamax. But no one in the world knew about cassette video recorders, and sales were pitiful. So Akio allocated a huge budget for a marketing campaign. But he was opposed by the head of Sony's American department, Harvey Shane, who was doing well in his position but saw no future for video recorders and believed that spending such vast sums of money on advertising was a catastrophic mistake. The argument didn't last long. After all, it was Akio who was the chief, and he had the last word. Betamax advertising explained to viewers that now they could watch their favorite programs whenever they wanted. The ad wasn't appreciated by Universal Studios and Walt Disney, who sued Sony. They believed that the Japanese company had created a copyright infringement tool. It was illegal to copy someone else's content. Akio realized how serious the charges were. It was clear to him that under those circumstances, he would lose the case because the copyright laws were written long before, when no video recorders existed. He advocated that Congress must deal with the issue, not the court, and that it was high time to change the laws because the tape recorder was just a tool for giving people the freedom to schedule their programming. Akio decided to petition the people instead of the government. He collected petitions, gained support of lawyers and journalists, traveled around the country, and gathered people to convey his arguments. Famous movie stars sided with their employers, the big production companies, and used their authority among their fans, winning more and more people over to their side. Society was split in two camps. The litigation lasted for 8 years and ended only in 1984. Finally, the court held that a video couldn't be considered a copyright infringement, and Sony won the case. Being at war with the American legal system and the movie studios, Sony didn't notice the enemy at home. The Japanese company JVC had developed a more successful VHS system. Of course, Betamax's image quality was better, but you had to buy an expensive TV to appreciate this picture, and the competitor wasn't so demanding. In addition, VHS could record 2 hours of video, unlike Beta that could offer only 1 hour. Hardly any movie could fit into this time. As a result, VHS began to monopolize the market. Competitors produced video recorders for VHS, but Sony was stubborn and stuck to its format. Unlike in the mid-70s and early 80s when Betamax generated huge profits, now profit was completely out of the question. Betamax was a loser. The war was lost. New things are often an improvement on old things. When once talking to Akio, one of his employees complained to him that he wanted to listen to music when walking in the park, but couldn't carry a large tape recorder like young people in New York did. Akio realized that many people found large tape recorders inconvenient to carry, and all the company needed was to develop a small, portable player. But no one liked Akio's idea. Even Masaru didn't support him, saying that he didn't see this as a solution to the problem. Although Masaru had transferred his powers to younger engineers by that time, the friend's support was always important. To prove his absolute confidence in his idea to his team, he said that he would resign if he didn't sell at least 100,000 devices by the end of the year after creating such a player. The team got down to work. The sound recording function as well as the speakers were removed from a usual tape recorder to reduce the case size. When the player with headphones was ready, even the engineers who created it were surprised by the sound quality, because now lossless sound waves reached right into the ears. Now it was time to come up with a name, because as you name the boat, so shall it float. This task was tackled by one of the deputies, the daring musician Norio Oga, who now held a managerial position. The player was designed for young people and could be used while walking. And at that time, a movie about Superman was popular in cinemas, and the name was born, Walkman. The player hit the Japanese market in 1979, but it was criticized by journalists for the lack of a voice recorder, and the company managed to sell only 3,000 devices in the first months. Oga decided to start a more aggressive marketing campaign. In addition to interesting and memorable advertising, he recruited Japanese celebrities to wear Sony headphones everywhere. This advertising proved to be more successful, and 20,000 players were sold the following month, and over 100,000 more in the following month. The sales skyrocketed. But it was the Americans who really appreciated the player. It wasn't just a player Sony was offering, it was a lifestyle. Headphones became an integral part of athletes and young people's lives. Millions of players were ordered and Sony couldn't cope with the demand. In addition, the underlying technology turned out to be quite complex, and competitors couldn't figure it out for a long time. The first were the analogs appeared only a few years later. Besides, Walkman became a status symbol. Superstars and athletes had it. Even Steve Jobs, whose player was a personal gift from Akio. Oga became the president of Sony in 1982. Soon after, the corporation reorganized. The company was divided into 5 operational groups: marketing, sales, product, service, and engineering. Akio was gradually transferring his power to Oga. Oga made his mark in the first year of his appointment. He headed a CD development together with Philips. Record companies criticized Oga and dubbed him the industry's enemy. They had spent so much time and money on establishing the vinyl record production, but the new invention threatened their business. They would have to start everything from scratch, as these discs were more convenient and durable than LPs. This is how the world's first CD player appeared, the CDP-101, that played compact discs, and its more compact version, the D50, shortly afterwards. This player threw a bomb into the audio world. The first model of the CD player didn't sell well, which can't be said about the second one. Akio believed that first he should introduce the new products to customers and receive profit afterwards. And he was rewarded. All the losses paid off after 6 months. At the same time the CD market had been shaped, many musicians began to record on CDs, and the CD production volume had grown to 50 million by 1986, far exceeding the vinyl record production. Sony created music, the device to listen to music on, the device to watch movies, but didn't have a movie studio. But in 1989, Akio bought out Columbia Pictures, the world-famous studio that owned the rights to legendary movies. The purchase cost was $3.5 billion. One of Akio's main motivations was a disappointing defeat in the war for the video recorder market. He believed that Sony would have become a monopoly if he had owned a movie studio before. Hollywood was uneasy about the Japanese company's influence on the cinema, but Akio assured them that he wouldn't interfere with the actors' affairs and gave them free rein. This resulted in huge losses. The losses from the new industry amounted to $3 billion in 1994. In that same year, Akio left the chairman position. He had a stroke and could no longer take care of the company's business, although he remained extremely influential. From that time, Oga became the full-fledged head of Sony. In addition to the loss-making movie studio, the economic downturn of the 90s and the weakening yen pushed the company into a crisis. Oga reorganized the company, creating a company within a company system. Each of them was autonomous and independently accounted for their profits and losses. And Oga's role was to control this empire. This system demonstrated that many industries were loss-making, but the Japanese mentality didn't allow to simply get rid of the productions, depriving people of work. Among other things, tape recorders were less and less popular. The market was full of cheap Chinese analogs, and the world was switching to the MP3 format, which Sony was unwilling to do since it had its own mini-disc format. All players supported the MP3 format, but Sony considered it the industry's enemy. They were sure that this format would allow for widespread piracy. Yes, it was now Sony who was concerned about copyright, since they had their movie studio and Sony Music recording studio. Consumers didn't like this policy. For example, they had to convert a track many times to download it to a Walkman. Sales slimmed to none. There were all-around problems with the compatibility of Sony's devices. Oga believed that it was he who was responsible for the company's crisis and that he failed to cope with the existing problems. He saw the only way out: to resign from the presidential position, transferring his powers to his successor. Thus, Nobuyuki Ide became the president of Sony in '95. Many managers didn't like Ide as president. He was an engineer and lacked the charisma that Akio or Norio had. However, he realized that the world was switching to digital technologies, and it was high time to enter the PC market. Sony released its Vaio laptop in '97. It was ultralight, had an attractive design, and was a better quality than a MacBook. The marketing company was also a success. By the time Sony's laptop was released, the company created websites where users could download their music and movies. But the laptop failed to generate a tidy profit for the company. The problem was simple: it was too expensive. An average buyer couldn't afford it, and the laptop was popular in the business segment only. However, Ide kept investing in the new development, making his colleagues irritated. The new president ignored the problems that arose after Ogi's reorganization. The companies had become too autonomous, the interaction between them had been disrupted, and the corporation had turned into a bureaucratic turtle. As a result, they missed the market they once dominated. In '99, they released 2 Walkman players with a memory stick memory card and a Vaio with a music clip, with a built-in music collection. Users didn't find anything new in these new players, and customers unleashed a barrage of criticism at the new releases. The problem was that these players were developed by 2 absolutely separate, unrelated divisions. As a result, the later released iPod player left not a single chance for Sony. The iPod was all around better. It had a friendly user interface, had a hard drive and a built-in battery, and supported the MP3 format, which was very important for customers. By the early 2000s, Apple controlled 60% of the market, leaving only 5% for Sony. The company was still suffering losses, the division separation grew deeper, and the solution seemed obvious. They had to refuse unprofitable divisions and restore the interaction between departments. But the Japanese mentality didn't allow them to fire people easily, but the American one did. Ide retired in 2005, and Howard Stringer took his position. He refused loss-making divisions, fired tens of thousands of employees, and shut down 11 plants and factories, as well as centralized the decision-making process. However, he overdid it a little. He fired the wrong people. The staff now lacked engineers, which decreased their device's quality, and that used to be Sony's best feature. And without it, it was hard to justify the high price. Batteries exploded, laptops overheated. Such natural disasters as earthquakes and tsunamis disrupted the supply chain, caused intermittent power outages, and factories stood idle. Stringer failed to promptly solve these problems, and the company's losses amounted to $20 billion by 2012. He resigned from his position the same year, and Kazuo Hirai became the new president. The new president sold most of the real estate, including the headquarters in New York, and restored the engineers-managers balance. But the most important thing was that he concentrated on Sony's best device, the Sony PlayStation. In the 1980s, Ken Kutaragi worked for Sony. He was a true game fan and devoted console enthusiast, but Norio's couldn't even imagine going in this direction, believing that games were something childish. At that time, Sony was focused on developing the CD technology, and Nintendo was the absolute leader in the game console segment. Discs were gradually replacing vinyl and cartridges, and Nintendo turned to Sony asking them to develop a disc drive for the Super Nintendo console. The president of Nintendo didn't like the terms of the contract, under which Sony controlled all the rights to the CD technology and received huge revenues from its sales. So instead, he turned to Philips for the technology. Oga considered this a betrayal and reacted emotionally. He instructed Kutaragi to develop their own console and provided him with excessive financing. Sony executives were dissatisfied with Norio's decision. They knew too many companies that went bankrupt trying to penetrate the digital entertainment segment, but it was a matter of principle for Oga. The console release was supported by a broad advertising campaign. Sony's console featured a revolutionary design and used no cartridges, only discs, which were very up-to-date. For the first time, a memory card could be used to save the game, and it worked really quickly. The most important thing was that the console supported three-dimensional games, which seemed impossible at the time. Within the first 6 months of sales, the company managed to sell 1 million devices, leaving its competitors far behind. Released in '94, the console immediately became popular. The company began to take the new industry seriously, and not only the company, Sony managed to challenge the stereotype that consoles were just children's toys and something unimportant. The company spent 6 years and a lot of money on developing the PS2 and got a top-class console as a result. Its characteristics were incomparable with those of competitors, and in 2001, a year after the PS2 was released, GTA 3 appeared, an exclusive game just for Sony. Most people bought the new console to play this game. Later, other developers began to adjust to Sony, and the company was doing very well. Among other things, the developers added DVD functions to the console, and now it could also be used for watching movies. So it was a bargain to buy the game console instead of buying a separate DVD player. As a result, over 100 million devices have been sold since 2006. However, this success relaxed the Japanese developers. Besides, the company had problems with the management at the time, and the PS3 release failed. The expensive-to-produce Blu-ray format was added to the console, which made it very expensive, almost twice as expensive as the second version. In addition, it was also very resource-demanding, loaded slowly, and froze all the time. Among other things, a cheaper and more undemanding Xbox console hit the market. As a result, the PS3 sales were 10 times lower than those of the PS2. In 2013, the game console market was rather empty. Competitors offered nothing new. The PS4 release was very well timed, and its lower price was a kind of redemption for the failure of the third version, and the pandemic of 2019 gave new life to the fourth PS. The game console sales covered the cinema losses, and as a result, the company's total revenue amounted to $18.6 billion in 2020, 2.3% up from 2019. The PS5 released in 2020 has become the fastest-selling console in Sony's history, with about 40 million devices sold to date. The company promises to release the sixth series in 2027. What should we expect from the Japanese company? Do you think the new release will be successful? Share your opinion in the comments.